Last month I did a video that I enjoyed very much and I had a lot of good feedback on, where I came up with my 10 greatest guitarists, British guitarists. Now these lists are interesting because these are different to a normal list, because I'm actually going to judge these musicians on not how famous they are, what famous band they are in, what everybody thinks about it who knows nothing about music and has only heard of the most obvious guitarists in the world. An aficionados, an elitist aficionados list. That's what we're going to have now. I am going to count skill, innovation, musicality, touch, all those things. These drummers, right, for me are the 10 greatest British drummers for me personally, right? So for you all sat down ready to see, you know, John Bonham cropping up on the list and Ian Pace. Now these are all wonderful drummers and I love them. But if we're measuring it on actual ability, musicality, all the things, I'm not just, because people go, oh, you seem to be interested in his technique, whether they can play fast. No, I'm not. I'm listening to the way they sound. I'm listening to the way they make a record feel. I'm listening to the way they can interpret music. I'm listening to the musicality that comes from a musician that is extremely gifted on their instrument, which I think a lot of the general public, they're not aware of and they don't hear. They don't hear. I think most people don't even hear the drums on a record. They're just there, right? And so what happens to the general public, if somebody seems to look flashy, I mean, I've done drum solos all my life. I've done drum solos in drum clinics, but I've also been in a ton of covers bands where I've had to do drum solos. And I know what impresses people in a pub as opposed to a clinic. When you're in a clinic, I've got to do time signatures in each limb and play over here and do this coordination and all that type of stuff. And they will go, oh, how can you do it? In a pub, you're just going to do John Bonham triplets as fast as you can and spin your sticks. That's what they're going to be impressed by. And so these sort of videos are there to challenge that idea, that dumb idea that we have in music, that you knowing about music, you knowing about skill, creativity, innovation, knowing about those things and having ears is somehow a bad thing, right? And you don't understand what proper music is about. You don't understand songs, playing for the songs, right? I challenge that. I'm a professional drummer. I've played for the songs half my life. When some bloke's telling me that, yeah, I've got to learn how to play for a song, I think that's how I used to earn my living. When I turned up in a studio, if I didn't play for the song, I didn't get paid. If I turned up on a gig and didn't play for the song, I didn't get paid. I was also very aware that I got a reputation of having a ton of chops amongst people who were hiring me. And so they expected me to do that. And so I knew I couldn't do that because they would have been so quick to say, Andy's really good, but just overplays all the time. Well, when I was young, that was definitely the case, but I had to learn to play for the song. I had to give the song the love, all right? These drummers can all do that in bucket loads, right? So now we've got that little bit of housekeeping out of the way. Let's start with my list of the greatest British drummers of all time, okay? At number 10, there was a number of drummers I wanted to put here. I actually wanted to put my mate Craig Blundell, who was a drummer that we sort of emerged on the sort of clinic scene 25 years ago at the same time. And whereas I slowly built my career off into sort of obscurity, he's gone up and up and up and now has one of the greatest drum gigs in the world, which is the Stephen Wilson Band. He's also playing for Steve Hackett. Craig is just such a cosmonaut. He's a cosmonaut of drumming. I'm going to change what I was going to say. He's definitely a cosmonaut of drumming, Craig is. And I want to mention him here because he's one of my favourite drummers and he's such an incredible player. He's a very quiet guy, very humble guy if you know him, but God, he can play. Another guy that seems to be able to play anything is a guy called Darby Todd. Darby, I'm sending some love to you. I love your drumming. What an incredible drummer that guy is. Been around for a while, but he's emerging more and more at the moment. He brought a brilliant drum solo album on, which I wish he sent me a copy of. He actually, I used to drum in a progressive rock band called Frost, and he played on a later Frost album, but I don't know him very well. He's messaged me once, but I'd love to have Darby on. I think he's a fantastic drummer. The other drummer I would like to mention is my mate Bobby Arechiga. What an amazing drummer, but he's not British, so he's not going to make the list. He's a horrible Yank, Bobby is, but God, he can play. Bobby can do things on the drums that nobody else can play. But no yanks on it. I don't care how long he's been born in Britain. And I don't care how much I've said if you live in Britain and you're a British citizen. I'm sure he's a British. I'm not going to have him on the list. Not even as I mentioned Bobby. Tough. But he is amazing. Right, so there's many drummers I could go through like this. Russell Gilbrook is an incredible drummer. Absolutely amazing. The late Robin Guy. This is the stalwarts of the British drumming community, and they are wonderful players. Who else? There's so many of them. I feel like I'm missing some out, but I've played tribute to them. But there's one guy that for me is an incredible drummer, and he's been around for a little bit longer, and he's just a monster. And I've got him at number 10, and that's Pete Riley. So I think Pete Riley should be on the list of being the 10th greatest British drummer of all time. Pete can play absolutely anything. I first saw him about 20 years ago play with Guthrie Govan. And Guthrie was great, but I was impressed with Pete Riley. I saw a clinic and he was chatting about Steve Smith and he was chatting about phrasing, and that's always been the thing that has impressed me. Pete Riley has got more chops than you need, right? His hands are absolutely incredible. He can do everything you need to do. He taught down at ACM for many years. He's educated so many drummers out there. He's just a wonderful player. But the thing that I love about his playing is his touch and his phrasing. Phrasing on drums is becoming a lost art because everybody's just blasting at the moment, right? When you used to listen to drummers before this sort of gospel chops thing emerged, you had all those chops, but your idea was to play something interesting rhythmically. And I always believe that as a drummer, if you wanted to have a drum solo and display some sort of virtuosity, the virtuosity you should be displaying should be a rhythmic virtuosity, because that's the language. It's painting pictures, telling stories with rhythm. And drummers are few and far between that can do that. Everybody on this list can. But Pete Riley is so accurate in the way he plays. His understanding of rudiments is very deep, and he understands how to apply them onto the kit. During COVID, he started to do some lessons, and I was trying to get my chops back together. And Pete's lessons were invaluable. A lot of the lessons took this idea of taking a rudiment and working it so it goes from right hand to left. Pete's left-handed and he plays a left-handed kit, but most left-handed drummers, because they're having to read everything the wrong way round and having to do that movement, I think they seem to have much greater hands in a way. Bonham was left-handed, for example. Cobham, I think, is left-handed. There's a whole host of drummers. Simon Phillips has moved over to being left-handed, even though he's right-handed. This is a very interesting thing. So I would love, again, to have Pete come on the channel and have a chat just about drums. He's been a big influence on me. I think he's a wonderful drummer and he's a great teacher. A few years back now, he developed cancer and he fought that off, thank God. Some of the people I know I've met who knew him said that even though he was very ill, he would still be turning up to rehearsals. He'd be lying on the floor. This guy eats, sleeps and drinks drums, which is what you have to do to get to that level. Pete Riley is a fantastic drummer, an all-round monster. If Pete, I will send you a link so you know I'm saying this. I send all my love to you, and I just want to say what a fantastic drummer you are, and what an inspiration you've been to me. Incredible. At number 9, I have the late, great John Hiseman. John Hiseman is massively underrated. He emerged in the 1960s, coming out of that sort of blues, rhythm and blues, little bit jazz. He comes in at the tail end of Ginger Baker. I believe he replaced Hiseman, replaced Ginger Baker in the Graham Bond band. which was also included players like Jack Bruce, John McLaughlin, Dick Hextall-Smith. And that was like a training ground for not just the blues and rock music coming together, but also the jazz improvisation. Graham Bond was an incredible musician as a keyboardist and a saxophone player, but a very troubled individual who died when he threw himself in front of a train back in 1974. Hiseman came out of that. Hiseman being a little bit perturbed by being in a band with so many drug addicts, in 1968 decides to form what is ostensibly a prog band, and one of the great prog bands, which is Colosseum. But Colosseum's really more of a fusion band. And he formed it because he didn't want to work with druggies anymore. He appears on Jack Bruce's Things We Like, which is a great album where he's paired against John McLaughlin. He was a drummer that played with John McLaughlin, it seems, quite a bit in the early days. And they're both fusion pioneers. I think with John Hiseman, he never went to America, did he? If he did, he would have probably been now a household name. What an incredible drummer. Double bass drum pioneer, a large kit pioneer, almost like a British Billy Cobham. He then forms Tempest. He brings Alan Holdsworth into the world on those early albums. And then he reforms Colosseum again in the mid-70s with Gary Moore on guitar. And those albums are brutal jazz rock. They're incredible. I first heard him when I bought, or my parents bought to be more exact, Variations by Andrew Lloyd Webber. Yes, that album, he drums on that. And I couldn't believe his drumming. He has a sound which is very futuristic at the time. He has an approach which is, like I said, he's like a British Billy Cobham, and there's a way of playing which is precise, which sort of drummers slowly start to emulate more and more. I often wonder how much he was an influence on the great Simon Phillips, because I could hear a similar approach to the drums between those two. I would love to ask Simon if that's the case. Probably got that one wrong. That's who I've got at number 9. At number 8, I do have one of those household name drummers. I've got Bill Bruford. I have to be honest, when we start to look at those early 70s drummers, you know, that sort of emerge out of the sort of British blues boom and then go into all those classic rock bands, you know, people like John Bonham, Ian Pace, Bill Ward, Simon Kirke, you know, all those great rock drummers, and then later Roger Taylor in Queen. And then we have the prog drummers, we have Carl Palmer and all those guys. Bill Bruford just shines amongst that group because he is a jazz drummer, and he doesn't play that down in Yes. Yes is the perfect band for him. He is able to bring in a jazz approach in much the same way Mitch Mitchell did, who's not on this list. And he should be, shouldn't he? Mitch Mitchell should be. I hate when this happens. I've gone through everybody. So Bruford is also, like Mitch Mitchell, a great drummer. Who's the greatest between those two? Is it Bruford or Mitch Mitchell? For my personal taste, it's Bruford. Where Bruford gets to on his later solo albums, like One of a Kind and Feels Good to Me, that's just incredible playing. He's got his own sound, he's got his own attack. But I am also going to have to put an honorary mention to Mitch Mitchell as well. They're together here. And if any other drummers crop into my head, I really wanted to try and focus on the less well-known drummers. But Bruford's here. We need to have him here as well. So Mitch Mitchell's got an honorary placing here, which means, Pete, you have to drop off now because they've got joint 7, which means there's no number 8, which means, Pete, you have to go, but I'm not going to have it happen. Right, I'm going to keep you on, Pete. I'm kicking off Mitch Mitchell for you. Hope you appreciate this. Right, at number 7, I have got John Marshall. John Marshall from Soft Machine replaced Robert Wyatt. What a drummer. What a drummer. When I was learning to drum in the early 80s, there were a couple of late night jazz programs on. There was a concert by somebody, I don't know who it was, but I know it was John Marshall on drums, and I videotaped this. It's quite avant-garde album band, and it was very influential on me. I also had a video of Philip Catherine playing with Neil Orth Pedersen, the greatest double bass player in human history, in a trio with John Marshall, and then when they appeared on Oscar Peterson's incredible jazz programs, can you believe, on the mainstream TV we had, Oscar Peterson's jazz program. And so that was my introduction to John Marshall. I absolutely loved his drumming. It was muscular, it was very jazzy, it was out there. He had a great touch, he was a great listener, he reacted in a brilliant way, had an authority. He didn't sound like the American drummers, he had his own sound and own style. An absolute master drummer. I then went and sorted out an album searched out an album with him on, and I ended up buying my first Soft Machine album, which was actually Land of Cocaine. Now, Land of Cocaine is not liked amongst the Soft Machine lot because they see it as being quite middle of the road. It's actually a Carl Jenkins album with a full orchestra and then these array of the best British jazz and fusion and prog musicians. I love this album. If you don't think it's a Soft Machine album, you'll absolutely love it. Yeah, it's quite accessible, but it's still out there. That was the first album that I ever heard Alan Holdsworth on the track Sly, and I can remember being dumbfounded. But I love John Marshall's drumming. He's a full-on jazz drummer. He can play rock as well. Now, if we fast forward to around about 2016, 17, I had an improvising jazz trio, electronic sort of experimental trio with the great guitarist Fayanzek and the incredible Steve Lawson on bass. And we opened up for Soft Machine. So we got this little soft opening of half an hour. When we sound checked, those guys came out and they gave us an hour. Can you believe it? Soft Machine, those guys, they gave us an hour. And John Marshall, who was getting on at that point, he came out, watched my playing, and we had a lovely chat, and he was so kind. You don't normally get this with musicians. He was so kind, and he was so incredible. And it was a few years, later, he's passed now. I think I've got it here because I've been listening to it quite a bit. I've got the most recent Soft Machine album, which is the last one with John Marshall on, right up to the last bit. He's such an incredible player. One of the great British jazz drummers of all time. Number 7, John Marshall. At number 6, I've had to put him on, and I thought, well, this is like one of the most famous drummers in history, British drummers. It's Phil Collins. The older I get, the more I realise how great Phil Collins is as a drummer. He obviously has more chops than a lot of the classic rock drummers. I can't imagine, really, some of those classic rock. They could have done it. I mean, Ian Pace with the Gary Moore Band does play jazz rock fusion. And he could do it. I'm sure Bonham could have done it. But could they have done it like Phil Collins? Could they have negotiated those Brand X charts like Phil Collins did? His drumming is incredible. He's played out there stuff with Brian Eno. And then by the 1980s, he's playing pop music. The guy's a consummate musician. He's an incredible songwriter, incredible singer. He's a multi-instrumentalist. But what we forget is this guy really can drum. And I'm positing here, if you take the mainstream drummers, the ones that everybody knows, if we're just going to take the Bonhams and the Ian Paces and the Ringo Starrs and all of them, who's the greatest of those sort of classic rock drummers? It's Phil Collins, without a doubt. And no one's going to ever say that. Us drummers know it. And it's not just the chops, it's the sound. A lot of these drummers were pioneering drum sounds throughout the 70s. The drum sounds in the 1960s might have been a couple of mics, maybe. If you're in the Hollies, that guy stuck a mic in the bass drum. He got 3 mics, maybe 2 mics, 4 mics. We go up from 4 tracks to 8 tracks. But by the 70s, suddenly we got these 16-track, 32-track. And these are the drummers who were pioneering a drum sound. Phil Collins goes for this sort of, concert tom, single-headed sound, tight, but the tom sounds are very big. He goes all the way through really pioneering that gated reverb sound in the 1980s. And somewhere around, I would say, and then there were three, which is not seen as being top-end Genesis. It's seen as transitional between their sort of full-on prog and the pop stuff. But in terms of drumming, go and listen to what Phil Collins is doing. It's ridiculous. His fills, his phrasing, it's the same thing I said about Pete Riley. But I think even Pete would admit his fills are iconic. He did the greatest fill in human history. Right? His fills are iconic. His taste, his sound is absolutely incredible. That's who I've got at number 6. Right. There's a whole host of jazz drummers, you know, Ronnie Verrell, Alan Gadley, Jack Parnell. There's a whole host of these I could go through. Millions of them. You got people like Tony Oxley. There's a whole, and I thought, I can't be going there. I'm just going to fill it up. So I need one proper jazz drummer to represent the whole lot. And of course, it's Phil Hiseman. Now, Phil Hiseman might not have been the greatest technician of the sort of British jazz drummers, but he had an approach and style which is above all of them. He emerged in the 1950s, playing with people like Johnny Dankworth, Tubby Hayes. He transitions towards rock very interestingly, and I think in the 60s, if he hadn't been marred by heroin addiction, then he may well be a lot well known. But what he did do was mentor Ginger Baker. Ginger Baker was nowhere near the drummer that Phil Hiseman was, but he took a lot of those ideas. And I feel that the DNA from Phil Hiseman through Ginger Baker, then from Ginger Baker to all those classic rock drummers, it originates there in his approach. I want to tell you a story about Phil Hiseman. I'm not a massive expert on him. So I can't go waxing lyrically about all the albums he's played on, and there are so many legendary stories about this bloke. But I can remember reading an interview with him where he explained his heroin addiction. It's a really interesting story. And I'll tell you it now because I think it needs to be told on the channel, and there's a lot to learn from this. He said that in the 1950s, playing on that scene, to earn a living, you had to play all the time. There was a lot of gigs. So people were going up and down the country doing tons of gigs. They weren't getting paid enough, but they were almost gigging every single night. The early rock scene in the UK is the story of that scene. Lots of musicians going up and down the M1, meeting up at services, playing at loads of venues and playing in loads of venues around London. So the only way you could keep going was to never be ill. Because once you got ill and you couldn't, and you stepped off that treadmill, these bands who had gigs booked would then go, oh, you know, Phil, can't you make the gigs this weekend? No worry, don't worry. And then before you know it, someone else has got it. And all those musicians are waiting around to try and get the gig. So the last thing they want to do is get ill. So what do you do when you are faced with being ill? And Phil Hiseman said in the 50s at some point, he was faced with being ill. And someone said, take this. It'll make you feel great and you will never get a cold or the flu again. And with that, he stuck a needle in his arm. A lot of those jazz musicians, and this is something that's never been said, it's often described that they were like troubled individuals and all this type of stuff. Now, I think their life was so hard that you had to, what's the word? anesthetize yourself to the lifestyle so that you could keep going, so you could keep getting the gigs, because if you didn't, someone else would take your place. And that's the big lesson I learned from Phil Hiseman. But go and check him out. He's a fantastic drummer, really fantastic drummer. Obviously, his lifestyle did not make him that healthy a guy, and he died in the early 70s. He's a forgotten genius, really is. I'll move on. Here we have the big four now, the big four greatest British drummers of all time. This is who I would say are. So at number 4, I got Gavin Harrison. Gavin Harrison from Porcupine Tree, from King Crimson. We all know he's one of the great prog drummers. What people don't realise is this guy's been around for a long time. When I first came across him, he was actually playing with the little pop pixie that was Lisa Stansfield. He also did a tour with Iggy Pop. This guy's a session player. He can play anything. In the 1980s, he was starting to write a column called Rhythmic Illusions for Rhythm magazine. I was into odd time signatures, but I was playing odd time signatures in a very rigid way, coming out of Neil Peart, trying to do what Billy Cobb was doing. And then this thing came out. My reading wasn't very great. And I love this because there would just be a few things to read, because it was much more about understanding these rhythms. I learnt to read music, and I've never been a great reader, but I learnt to read music to read Gavin Harrison's articles, because I wanted to understand what these rhythmical illusions were. This really influenced me. There were so many ideas that he covered. There were so many ideas he covered in those articles, and that overriding, right, which is a thing where you have sort of two time signatures existing at once, so you have a quarter note pulse going through. He was not just doing that. I mean, Neil Peart did that, but he was doing it in very interesting ways. Creating like displacements, making people feel like the rhythms are in the wrong place or the tempo's in a different place. All these ideas influenced me greatly. If you listen to the Rain albums that I made, which was my own band where I could get to write the material as well as play it, you will hear the influence of Gavin Harrison in that sort of a rhythmical illusion. And what I got out of him was the way that threes and twos exist together. They exist, there's like two universes. There's a compound universe and a simple time universe. And they exist together. And many drummers don't see that. They're either in one or the other, but you can be in both. That's what I got for Pete Roddy. Anyway, time goes on. Chris Maitland leaves Porcupine Tree, and then suddenly Gavin drops in, and this is the time in 2005 when I'm starting to work on the progressive rock scene. So I'm like, oh my God, it's Gavin Harrison, it's that drummer. So I'm an early Porcupine Tree fan, and I start to hit, and I get when it came out, I get the album with Sound of Music on, and I suddenly hear what he's doing for the first time. So that's absolutely incredible. For me, Gavin Harrison is one of those drummers. He's not like me as a player. He comes out of the Steve Gadd school. And what's interesting is perhaps technically, the drummer I've got more from than anybody would be Steve Gadd. But I see myself as a sort of fiery, out-of-controlled, sloppy drummer. That's the way I play. And Steve Gadd is all calm and groovy, very, very tasteful phrasing. And Gavin comes from that school. Of course, his big influence is another great British jazz drummer that if this was the top 20, he might well have got on the top 20, which is Steve Jansen from Japan. Gavin's just a monster. He's got a touch taste on the drums, which is absolutely unique. He's one of our great drummers. So that's who I've got at number 4. At number 3, I've got one of the greatest musicians in the world. If I was start to run down the great fusion keyboardists working on the planet at the moment, you'd have to say, well, who's the bloke that's played with John McLaughlin, for example? Because he always has ridiculous keyboardists. Who's Billy Cobham got on keyboards? Who's all the main fusion guys using on keyboards at the moment? And it would be Gary Husband. But Gary Husband is so great that I have got him at number 3 on the drummers list now. He's a drummer, but he's also a pianist. He's unique. Jack DeJohnette's a very fine piano player and has done proper session work, jazz concerts. So Jack DeJohnette is probably the equivalent of, so is Gary Husband our British Jack DeJohnette? That's an interesting thought, isn't it? Jack's incredible, and Gary Husband is. Gary Husband, there's a ton of Billy Cobham in his play. There's a son of Tony Williams. There's a ton of Jack DeJohnette. Right, there's other drummers in there as well. There's British jazz drummers in there. He was brought up in the British jazz scene. You can tell from a very young age, he's sort of within it. I've read interviews with him where his knowledge of the British jazz scene is incredible. And I believe Louis Maholo, is that the name of the guy? Also influenced Gary. So there's a whole bunch of really interesting influences there. He's playing in various big bands throughout the 1970s, a little child prodigy. You know, you can see all these videos going back to when he was a teenager, a little bit like Simon Phillips. Alan Holdsworth, one of the greatest musicians of the 20th century, decamps from the UK to America. And he ends up doing exactly what John McLaughlin did and jump into Tony Williams' Lifetime. And again, he makes one of the greatest fusion albums. I may believe it with Tony Williams' Lifetime. And with Tony Williams, he finds a way for his guitar to work and talk with the drums backing up in a certain way. Tony Williams and Alan Holdsworth is a match made in heaven because they both have a certain approach to time. Holdsworth eventually makes his way back to the UK and forms a band called IOU. And into that works a drummer who's 19 years old, but also has the keys to that approach. But this guy's 19 and can give himself willingly to the thoughts and ideas and concepts of one of the greatest musicians of the 20th century, which is Alan Holdsworth. Alan Holdsworth's solo albums are indebted to Gary, and Gary's indebted to Alan. They're like this. And they create a way of playing together, which, especially on that first IOU album, it's a new way of drums. It's a high-powered Elvin Coltrane approach. Cobham had done it to some extent with John McLaughlin. Tony had laid the grounds with Holdsworth. Vinny does it on Shut Up and Play Guitar. There's a certain way approaching improvisation. And Gary does it with Holdsworth, and that becomes the way Holdsworth improvises on those albums is absolutely unique. When he then goes over to States, he brings in Chad Wackerman. Chad Wackerman must have been working in the shadow of what Gary did. And Chad Wackerman's amazing on those albums as well, incredible drumming. But I feel that Gary Husband really pioneers something with the Holdsworth group, which is so important to the world of drumming. This is why he is number 3 on this list. His compositions are very important. City Nights. I mean, can you imagine being a drummer like Gary, writing a tune like City Nights, and then having Vinnie Colaiuta come on your composition when you're a drummer and put down the greatest drum track ever recorded in human history, which is what I think City Nights is, maybe the greatest guitar solo in human history. In fact, City Nights in those 2 or 3 minutes might be the greatest piece of music ever made by mankind. That's the where I'm at. That's what I am. I'm sorry. That's the way I see the world. Gary Husband. He watches the channel. He's been on the channel. I went to see Scott Henderson. I went down to Ronnie Scott's last year and stood in the queue. And I turned around to my mate and said, that's Gary Husband walking down the road. And as he walked up, he recognised me, and it was a wonderful thing. And I spent the evening with him, and it was an honour to be with him. He's a lovely man. He's humble, right? But he is one of the great musicians. It's beyond drumming. Gary Husband is something else. A national treasure, right? And if you're going to start putting statues up to people, yeah, Lemmy's great, but where's the Gary Husband statue? I want a Gary Husband statue somewhere. Where's he originally from? Let's petition it. At number 2, I have Mark Mondesir. Mark Mondesir, as a very young man, emerged around about 1985, playing drums and playing in the band of Courtney Pine. Courtney Pine emerged in the mid-80s in the UK, sort of off the back of the whole Winter Marsalis thing. We started looking for our own homegrown Winter Marsalis, and what we found in Courtney Pine was a player that for me was far more interesting, because this guy wasn't just wanting to play like hard bop from 1962. He was interested in reggae, he was interested in hip hop, he was interested in funk, sorry, what did I say? Even rock music. There's a whole bunch of stuff there. And on drums, they had this little kid. He looked like a little kid. I can remember watching him. Omnibus did a documentary on it, and that's where I first saw Mark Mondesir. And he had this drum kit, and it looked like it was a tiny little thing. And he was playing like this absolute monster. Why? Because Mark Mondesir was, as much as he came out of Elvin Jones and Tony Williams, he's also coming out of Billy Cobham, Narada Michael Walden, all those fusion guys. When I heard him, it was incredible. For me, I had seen the equivalent, if not more, beyond what the Americans were doing. And so throughout the 80s, eventually around about 87, 88, I got to see the Courtney Pine group with Mark Mondesir on drums. I sat in the audience. He was playing loud. He was playing double bass drums. He was blurring on double bass drums, like at roll speed. I never heard a drummer playing the double bass drums so fast. It had an aspect of almost like thrash metal. The way he was working inside that modal thing with Courtney Pine, it just redefined drumming for me. And the biggest thing was the way he was interpreting what Cobham did, what Tony Williams did, what Jack and Jonette did onto the kit. There was an approach that was beyond all of those for me. It was massively influential, and it started pushing me to playing or trying to play like that myself. The other drummer that influenced me hugely was Vinnie Colaiuta, but for me, what Vinnie was doing was echoed by what Mark Mondesir was doing. The thing that I never was able to get close with Mark was the lightness of his hand. The speed that he was playing at was not coming from like a sort of tense energy, which is great. Common had that. Dennis Chambers was emerging at that time, and he had that. Mark Mondesir it was like a butterfly play the drums, and it was so powerful. So I started to follow him round. I saw him with the Mondesi brothers, which was like my Mavish Nuxtra, because I could go and see him live. I used to go and see him play with Julian Joseph. I can remember once sat like about, probably about 8 foot away in the Birmingham Roddy Scotts, watching him play, and he was doing this solo, and he was playing so light, but so fast and so powerfully, that he hit his tom, and the tom went like this. I think he was probably playing a pearl kick, something like that, and they got the rod that goes to the tom, so this thing's just stuck. So he was stuck, and he smiles, and then with the one hand he carries the solo on whilst cradling this tom and delicately placed it back, while this hand was playing something that I cribbed off him, which were these flammed runs from cymbals down to toms, and he just said, whoa, and this hand just went, and I was like, oh wow, yeah, it was the technique, yeah, it was the speed, but it was in the service of the music. It was about energy. Mark Mondesir is also a very funky drummer. This guy really should have been a household name. He should have got the big gigs. This is where the jazz thing comes and is prejudiced against you. When I first started this channel quite early on, I got a text message off him. Hi, this is Mark Mondesir. I was like, oh wow. I was chatting to Mark a few times. I went down to see him, met up with him. He came up here, recording with Alex Hutchins. And last year, I was very intimidated to do a gig down in London, and he came down with Mona Zam, who was the guitarist in the Mondesir brothers. It was just so intimidating. I tried my best. Mark Mondesir is one of the UK's greatest drummers, without a doubt. He's also a massive influence on me. It's a huge influence, absolutely huge influence. I've chatted with him a lot. His knowledge of jazz fusion history is ridiculous. He's taken me to task on a number of things. You know, I've chatted to him, not for a while now. He has a lot of high standards. He's turned me on to a lot of great fusion. He is a consummate player. He's one of the greatest. Mark is one of the greatest. Again, sending all the love out to you, Mark. You're such an influence. And I know every time I see him, I'm too gushy. I know that. And it's because I feel indebted to these people. I'm so indebted to them. It's not just the fact that he influenced me and I play a certain way and I've got a certain approach on the drums, blah, blah. It's not that. It's much more about that these people gave me a direction to my life. And again, and I think Mark suffered with this, I definitely suffered with this, because I was into the Mavish Nuxtra, Return to Forever, and Lenny White and Dorado Michael Walden, and I was playing like that. I just never got offered the work because I was seen as being a drummer that was too chopsy in my field. I tried to go towards the jazz thing, but in the British jazz scene is really quite toxic, I believe. And me coming in playing like an American style fusion player, they just didn't like. They wanted me to sound like Roy Haynes, who I love. Roy Haynes is great, but that's what they want in the British jazz scene. I'm sure Mark suffered with this as well. He's one of the few British fusion and jazz drummers to have worked with all the international guys. Now, I'm going to state something really contentious here. If you go back now to that Courtney Pine group, the one that the mainstream media decided to push, God knows why, Courtney Pine got an omnibus documentary right from day one. All right, Gary Crosby, Courtney Pine, Julian Joseph, Mark Mondesir. Right, that quartet. Gary, Courtney, Julian have all got their OBEs, their MBEs. I'm sure, I mean, as Courtney got his knighthood, he'll get a knighthood eventually for services to music. The one guy out of those that's really played with the American guys, the guy that's played with Jan Hammer, the guy that's played with Jeff Beck, the guy that's played with John McLaughlin, is Mark Mondesir. So why has he not got? Where's his OBE? Where's Mark's OBE? Why hasn't he got it? Why has Mark not got it? And the other guys have. That exposes to me a truth about the British jazz scene, which is also apparent in my stories I'm about to tell for the guy I've got number one. For me, the greatest British drummer of all time is Simon Phillips. Do I need to tell you who Simon Phillips is? I haven't been able to get through this without mentioning him already. Simon Phillips was the son of Sid Phillips. If you want to know about him as a person and his career, I've interviewed him on the channel. Go and check out one of my favourite interviews. And Simon, I'll let you know I put you at number one. And I want you to come back, Simon, just so I can send my messages via the video. I want you to come back, give us an email and come and talk about AI and modern production. Because putting his drums aside, Simon is one of the most knowledgeable people about production, musicality and production, engineering, sound, how the drums should be recorded, how they should fit in a band, how old school recording was, how digital technologies is. He is just such a rounded musician. I first came across Simon Phillips when I bought Rhythm magazine. And I opened it up, and so this would have been at 84, 85, right? I think it was 85 was the first time. Now, I'd been listening to him for a long time because as a new wave of British heavy metal fan, the Judas Priest album I went and bought out, which is still my favourite Judas Priest album, was Sin After Sin. And I didn't know who this bloke was, but the drumming on Dissident Aggressor, that was like metal drumming. That was the beginning of thrash metal drumming, all there. In 1975, who the hell's this playing on here? I didn't know it was some 18-year-old kid. You know, how old was I when I got that? I'm 12, 13. He's like only 5 years older than me when he made that. So I'd been listening to him for a long time, didn't put it together. I bought the 801 Live, is it called, as well, being a prog fan. Simon was on that, incredible drumming. I didn't put it together. Bought Rhythm magazine, opened it up, and I was a big Billy Cobb fan, big Stuart Cope fan. There's a big Tama ad. And I look and it's like Billy Cobham plays Tama. Stuart Copeland plays Tama. Bill Bruford plays Tama. Simon Phillips plays Tama. These four guys. And I looked at Simon Phillips and I looked at that drum kit. I thought, who the hell's that? And I worked out he was on these records. And then at that point, or around about then, Pete Townsend comes on the tube and he does Give Blood, and I recorded it. I simply became obsessed with Simon's drumming. It wasn't about chops. It was to do with taste, sound, musicality, groove. Simon just had a sound that I absolutely loved so much to this day. He just has a touch on the drums, which is so musical. He never sounds like he goes wrong. I don't think he can go wrong. He's so relaxed and yet so fiery. His chops are ridiculous. At that point, Simon Phillips becomes one of my favourite drummers. And it's so eclectic. You know, 1 minute he's playing with Jeff Beck, and the next minute he's playing like on a heavy metal record, and then he's playing like with Mike Oldfield. In recent years, he's played with Hiromi, and I believe that those trio Hiromi albums with Simon and Anthony Jackson, that's perhaps the greatest jazz rock fusion group of the last 20 years. It's just incredible, absolutely incredible. I'm just going to be gushing over Simon. I've done 3 quarters now. This could be a long one. I'm really going to get it all out because I haven't really done it. Simon, for me, needs his own video. Maybe he needs his own video. There's so many albums there. I've got so many stories about Simon. I've told many of these stories on the channel because when I got the gig with Rock Plant in 1999, I got endorsed to Tama. I was very proud to be endorsed to Tama. And they said, would you like to do some drum clinics? I said, what, me? They went, yes, you could play, Andy, but you're also good at talking and you're a teacher. I said, well, why do you want me to do the clinics? Well, you know, we bring these big famous drummers over from, you know, the States, and they come out with their kit, but their kit is like 50,000 quid. And the kids can't buy it. So if you were to play an intermediate kit, which sounded amazing, and those kits did sound amazing, could you get on stage and play and that's the way, you know, I said, yeah, brilliant. So that's what I did. And the very first clinic tour I ever got booked onto was Simon Phillips, Southend 2000. I'll never forget it. I learnt more in that day about drums. And I tell the story to Simon on the recent interview, but that was an incredible week, you know. Just driving with Louise King, who was the editor of Rhythm magazine, and Simon Phillips, and just chatting to Simon like a kid. Because these musicians, however great they are, they're still like little kids. And we still love talking about these musicians, you know. And he was telling me stories about Art Blakey, Billy Cobb, and Frank Zappa. It's all on the channel here. On the final clinic we did. Now, I'm sure Simon can't remember any of this because he's doing this all day long. But for me as a drummer, this is one of the highlights of my drumming life. And the thing was, I'd been building up to doing this clinic tour. And back then, I was 32 years old and I got some chops. I've still got chops, but I had the fire and I wanted to prove myself. And I think I played reasonably well. I've got a recording of one of them and I did play reasonably well. I'd love to see some video footage of me from that because it was just a wonderful experience. One of the gigs we did in Sheffield, we had 1,400 people turn up. So me getting up in front of 1,400 British drummers made me for a short while like a household name. If I went to a drum show, people were walking up saying, Andy Edwards, we saw you with Simon. So this was a momentous thing. I've talked about it elsewhere, but I'm now going to tell you a story that I haven't told, or I might have, but it's not been told so many times. A couple of years ago, I got asked to do the drumming for a progressive rock band, a great American progressive rock band called Octa in Sky. In the end, it didn't happen because I was going through a whole bunch of personal problems at the time. I'd lost my job and I was just not in a great way. And I wasn't great to Octa in Sky. I didn't let them know what was going on. I was in a bad place, really. When they sent me the album over, they said, could you learn these? And most of the tracks were pretty easy to learn, but the drummer on them was Simon Phillips, Guthrie Goes on guitar. And when you're trying to play a Simon drum part, you just know that even when it's simple, that you've still got to come up with that part that sounds like that. But there was a couple of pieces which were modern classical pieces for piano, which the keyboard player was the lead of the band. She'd learnt them really well. But then she sent them out to Simon, and Simon had orchestrated these drum parts. Now, you can find out, I'm not putting myself down. I play some complex stuff on this channel. If you want to check out me playing over a tune called The Anxiety Demon on here, you'll see that's a pretty tricky tune. I've played the Black Page on here. Black Page I can play. There's no real issue. I could get my head around it. I couldn't get my head around what Simon was doing. I just couldn't do it. The tune was really hard. It never repeated, all right? I got a chart. My reading wasn't good enough to read for the piano chart. That was probably one of the weaknesses I had, where Simon's reading probably is. I tried to create my own chart. A lot of it was just the beauty of Simon's drumming just made it seem impossible. And I spent a few days trying to nail, and I just could not do it. It beat me. Simon beat me. Oh my God, he's really one of the great players. His band Protocol has kept jazz fusion alive. Some of the videos on YouTube where they're recording down onto tape, it's just beautiful. He's such a great drummer. He can play anything. He's a lovely guy. He's the best bloke in the world, Simon Phillips, as I would say. Really would. He's full of stories. He's a raconteur. He's a gentleman. And he is really one of the greatest drummers of all time. He's not just he's definitely the greatest British drummer. But, God, that guy's got class. He's got a sound. It's like Steve Gadd. He's in that rare breed, Elvin Jones, Tony, Cobham, Simon. He's got a sound. Now, I know that he was very influenced by Billy Cobham. You can tell that. You can tell when you listen to his early playing that he's in this sort of big band drumming, Sid Phillips band. And then Cobham comes out. He decides to go left-handed and all that type of stuff. And he does the work and he has that big kit, got all the toms. But for me, he doesn't sound like Cobham. He's got his own sound. Simon Phillips is Simon Phillips. You know, I could ape him because his sound is so strong. You know, I could like over the top of double bass. That would be a Simon lick. You know, that I could just hear it moving around the toms. The way he plays around the toms. You know, the way he hits the backbeat. I cannot get it. The double bass drums, the way he plays them, and they're so light and effortless. So when you hear me go, oh my God, I need to back off here. I need to back off. His commitment to sound, his commitment to the sound of the drums, right? There is no compromise with him. You know, he plays, I think he has ambassadors on his toms, which have a ton of tone. He has a big drum kit in there, big shells, and that should really sound like a noise. But his kit is balanced. Everything's balanced across the whole kit, and he utilizes that in his sound. If you have a session from Simon and he's just doing a backbeat, right, you're still going to get the stems of the overheads, the room, and then all the mics on his toms, because what you're getting is the toms are singing. They're not just there for him to hit. Those toms are there to create this whole. I believe that's his great innovation for drums, is that. And it's the nuclear physics of drums. I could get into the back end of this. I could talk about his open-handed playing. I could talk about the way he uses singles. It's almost like he can do double strokes. But if he can play something with singles, he's always going to go for singles. That's a sort of, he's never going to cross his hands over. He's never going to play doubles. He doesn't stick to it, but that's a mental approach he's got. If you listen to, he made, what was the name of that? He made a hard bop album in 2000. I've got it. He's playing straight jazz. He's got his right cymbal over on the right. He's playing jazz right-handed. He's playing jazz right-handed and he's playing it left-handed. Mark Mondesi is the same. This is just superhuman. Even when we go to the American guys, even when we start to look at, you know, the likes of the Vinnies and Weckles, and then we look at the modern guys like Matt Garsker and all these players, you know, J.D. Beck, that are just astonishing. But you don't quite see that. I've got to the end of the video. Simon, sending some love to you. I am very honoured that I've been able to sit down with Simon, Mark, Gary. I had a little bit of a chat with Pete, and I think back when I was doing clinics over at ACM. Bill Bruford I've sat down with, John Marshall I've sat down with. All of those I've sort of sat down and been able to have a chat. Because they're British drummers and I'm a British drummer. And I salute Britain, I salute England, I salute the great British drummers that we have produced. I'm patriotic, I'm feeling patriotic now. So I salute you all. And I think I'm done. Bye-bye. Sorry to interrupt the show with this rude
and annoying way, but I just wanted to tell you about a few ways that you can support me here on YouTube and get access to even more weirder and wackier content. First of all, you could become a patron. You could become a free member or a paid up member. I have over 300 extra videos on there, and if you don't even want to become a member, please pop over, because you can access my collections where you can purchase even more weirder and wackier video content. If you want to support me financially with a little tip, buy me some biscuits or maybe some crisps, you could pop over to my PayPal tip jar. I also have a Substack where I have lots of clever, academic and thought out articles where I explain my ideas on art, culture and creativity in a more intelligent way than I do here, plus a whole ton of podcasts. If you want to know what my music sounds like, you can pop over to my Bandcamp. Over there, you'll be able to listen to over 50 albums, and if you want to access them all, you could become a subscriber. And last but not least, if you want to support the wonderful studio where I film these lovely videos, which is actually a charity trying to help people out in the community become more creative, here is the website where you could drop a few pounds or dollars or whatever the currency is in your country in there. Thanks for listening, and back to the show.